What does it look like to truly be a superhero in our own professional field? And what would it make possible in your life as a content strategist, a content designer, a UXer, a writer, whichever field you come to this conference in? What would it make possible if you could lose the imposter syndrome and really own your brilliance in the work that you do and the way that you show up in the world? That's what this session is going to be all about today. Hello, I'm Tracy Playle. I am the CEO of Pickle Jar Communications, and I'm also the founder of the Utterly Content Conference. So you may have already met me in this conference and this festival so far. What do I want you to know about me as I go into this session with you? I want you to know 3 things about me. I want you to know that I spend a large proportion of my life working as a content strategist. I'm the chief content strategist at Pickle Jar Communication. I've been in this work for almost 2 decades now, and I've been on such a journey to really understand my place in the world as a content strategist, what it means to the work that I do, what I specialise in, and how I actually get to carve out a space for me and my own brilliance in this really complex industry. I want you to also know that I'm a coach. I trained with accomplishment coaching. I have an entirely separate coaching practice, and I specialise in coaching people who feel a little bit lost and often have confidence issues and a dose of imposter syndrome that feels like it might be holding them back to really living the life that they want to live. And so I'm going to be bringing some of that experience and those insights into today's session, combining them with my work as a content strategist. But there's a third piece that I really want you to know going into this session, and that's a piece about my own humanity. This isn't just a session with me sharing with you intellectual theories and concepts about confidence and owning our brilliance, but actually something that's really true to my own heart, because it's a journey that I've been on for most of my career, most of my life, and a place in which I still need to do the work on myself even today. So I'm really sharing with you a piece of my own humanity in this session, not just my content strategy knowledge or my coaching insights. I really hope this session is going to bring it all together. Because what we're really talking about in this session is a thing that overhangs so many of us working in content professions. And that's this dose of imposter syndrome that so many of us seem to carry with us. We're going to start by talking a little bit about how imposter syndrome actually shows up. And let's normalise this for a second. Imposter syndrome isn't a real syndrome. It's not like a health condition. It's not something you can be diagnosed with. It tends to be something that we're diagnosing ourselves with. But basically, it refers to this sense that we feel we don't belong, or we feel we're not good enough no matter how brilliant we might be. That we can be the most successful person in the world, and yet when we stare in that mirror, what actually stares back at us is, let's say, a loser, or whatever the version of it that your own internal gremlins might declare you to be. So it shows up in many different ways. It shows up as us having a sense that people will find something out about us, that there's some deep dark secret about us individually that so far we've been fooling the rest of the world, and that they haven't yet found out that we don't belong, we're not good enough, we don't know enough, or that we are just a total fraud in this work. That perhaps we feel that we are making it up as we go along. Or we might tell stories like this: I only got the job as a content strategist because the boss doesn't really understand content strategy. Or one that I hear quite a lot when I'm speaking to fellow content strategists at conferences: it's not uncommon for people to introduce themselves to me with something like this: I'm just becoming a content strategist. I'm just getting to know this work. In the early days, almost like some kind of armour that we build up around ourselves by declaring that we're new to this work so that people can't find out what we don't know. And so the problem when we carry these voices in our heads and these stories about ourselves is that we end up completely diminishing all of the achievements, all of the brilliance, all of the things that we know, all of the things that we know to do, all of the ways of being that we inherently actually fundamentally are as human beings. We chuck it all out of the window and reduce ourselves down to something that is so much smaller and so much less powerful than we actually are. And so, in order to protect ourselves and protect the world around us as we see it from these things, these stories in our head that we hold to be true, we start to act accordingly. We start to build up this wall around us that actually hides our brilliance and our power from the rest of the world. And the bricks in this wall are behaviours like playing small, making compromises, resenting people, making ourselves wrong, feeling the need to over-explain, defending ourselves, holding out for the thing to change, holding out for that day when I will be confident, when I will own my brilliance. We might wait for the proof or the evidence that we're brilliant rather than just believing that we actually are. We beat ourselves up. We live a life from a place of fear. And we may hide, over-explain, or just avoid things altogether because when the imposter is present, we have this true sense that we don't belong. I have it that we all belong. That everybody listening to this talk right now belongs exactly right where you are. But all of these behaviours that we're just talking about, those bricks in this wall that we put up around ourselves when we are struggling with imposter syndrome, really stems from these fears that we have about ourselves. And those fears land as being very, very real. In fact, they even land as being the truth to us. But they're actually just stories. They're stories that we made up. And I think that because we work in a relatively embryonic and ill-defined profession, we don't actually have the clarity of the structures or the clarity of role descriptions or even clarity of ways to do things and structures for doing things within our profession. And so what that means is, as a content strategist, we spend a lot of time operating in the space of the unknown. And here's the thing with imposter syndrome. Our imposter voice or our inner gremlins actually really, really loves the unknown because it can use it against us. When we're in the space of the unknown, it can use that gap of being in the unknown to fill the gap with these stories about ourselves that are all made up, but are simply there to serve to hold us small and to keep us believing that we don't belong. I want to reflect for a second on why I think this is so prevalent in the content professions. And that's because when we really look at all of the things that a content strategist might be, it includes so many skills, competencies, areas of practice that it in a way becomes overwhelming and can lead us to believe that a content strategist is someone that knows everything about all of these things, from audience research to content marketing to taxonomy to information architecture to SEO to being the most amazing copywriter in the world to designing governance and workflow processes to being able to do all of the content structuring and the content modeling work, to be able to really grasp editorial strategy, and to be able to now do the conversation design work as well. And if we hold this vision of what a content strategist is to be true, then we're setting ourselves an impossible goal. None of us could ever actually be a content strategist. So my invitation to you is to shift what you see a content strategist to be. Instead, think of yourself more like a surgeon. So a surgeon wouldn't do every single type of surgery. I'm not sure that I would want my plastic surgeon also doing my neurosurgery. I'm not sure that I'd want a dental surgeon doing my cardiology. And so think of content strategists like this. We operate within a similar framework, and yet we all have our unique specialisms within it. So you might be a content strategist that focuses more on content engineering and has a sense of a strong skill set in content modeling, content structuring, information architecture. Or you might be a content strategist who really specialises in some of the output side of things. For example, content marketing, copywriting, SEO, or developing editorial strategies. Or you might be a content strategist who is a real specialist in content operations. So you might really focus on the people side of things like governance and workflow design. What I'm making the case for is that in order for us to, as an industry, actually overcome this large dose of imposter syndrome that we all carry, we need to stop talking about content strategy as being a profession and start instead to think about it as an industry. We need to stop seeing ourselves as being a Swiss Army knife and start instead to recognise that what we really are, collectively, is the Avengers. We're pretty damn awesome, but we all bring our own unique specialities, skills, and stuff into this space as well. We all have our own stories that really, really shape who we are, how we show up, and how we can use our superpowers to the best in the work that we do. But it requires us to work together and collaboratively. And I'm going to share with you that for a long time, my own experience of imposter syndrome also wanted to hold me separate and alone. It didn't want me to work collaboratively, because working collaboratively carried the risk of the vulnerability of people finding out that I was not so good at certain things. So I would hold myself alone. I would hold myself separate. I would be quite happy standing up on stage sharing my thing, but actually when it came to just being down there talking to people, really sharing our experiences, I would want to shy away. I would get really anxious about being amongst crowds of other content strategists. I had such a dose of FOMO when I first started my own consultancy back in 2007 that I would spend every hour of every day clicking on every link on Twitter through this fear that there was something out there and yet another thing that I needed to know, needed to find out about. And the words "I don't know" were perhaps the most terrifying words that I could ever utter. And the consequence of this was not just that it wanted to hold me separate and alone from our community, but that it also meant that I struggled to really see and love and relish in the success of other people. In fact, I wanted them to fail, because only through their failure could I actually see myself as belonging. And what a horrible, poisonous way to go about living our lives. That we either want to hide ourselves or avoid, or keep believing that we're not good enough, or we want other people to fail, so that we can therefore feel that we belong. Neither of these are a powerful and empowering place to come from in the work that we do. So I have an assertion that we have a real commitment and a need to start overcoming this problem that many of us have of believing that we're an imposter. So I really started to presence myself to what I saw as being my superpowers as a content strategist. I recognised that I was great at discovery work, at strategic alignment. I'm really good at the stakeholder engagement stuff. Some of you may have attended my pre-conference workshop on this. I have a good skill at developing new frameworks or seeing things a different way to be able to put new structures around them. And because I'm good at the people side of things, I'm also pretty good at content ops and the training and coaching side of the work that we do. So I realise that I have these superpowers, but a superhero isn't just the sum of their superpowers. A superhero also has a sense of being and how they show up in the world that really truly takes you from being someone that just has superpowers to actually being a superhero. And so when I started to do the work on myself as a coach, I started to get really present to this, that my superhero elements, characters, are actually curiosity, creativity, and connection. What I'm actually asserting here is that we need to be present in overcoming our imposter syndrome, not just to the things that we do and the skills that we use that we might hold ourselves to be good at, but actually how we're being about it. And so that's where we're going to spend a lot of the rest of the time in this session looking. We're going to look not just at what you're doing that makes you a superhero, but also how you're being that makes you a superhero with true power. The underlying premise of this is to consider that we can't always actually control what's going on around us. As content strategists, we're often at the effect of many other moving pieces, moving parts, and multiple people involved in this work. But what we can do is control how we be about what's going on around us. And that's the real difference between a superhero and someone that just has superpowers, is that a superhero is really present to how they be about things. They're very intentional about their being. And that's what I'm going to have you take a look at right now. So I'm going to have you all do an exercise for a couple of minutes. What I'd like you to do is to write a list of your powers. These are the skills that you have, the things that you're great at doing, and really capture that list of the things that you perceive to be your superpowers. So you might remember mine were discovery, strategic alignment, stakeholder engagement, content operations, training, and coaching. Once you've written that list, maybe take a minute at most to do that, I then want you to write a list of your superhero being words. So mine were curiosity, creativity, and connection. What are your being words that actually make you a superhero, not just someone that has superpowers in this work? How are you being when you're at your most brilliant version of yourself? So I'm going to give you a timer for 2 minutes now, and just spend that time just writing these down and seeing what you come up with. Welcome back. How did that go for you? I'm curious, and perhaps you'll share in the chat box with us or on Slack. What did you discover about yourself when you really started to look not just at your skills, but also at your being? And how loud was your imposter syndrome voice as you did this exercise? I deliberately didn't give you this going into the exercise because there was an opportunity for you to really presence yourself to that conversation with your imposter gremlin inside your head. But these are some of the being words that you may have ended up with. You might be grace, you might be sage, you may be insight, you might be elevation, you may be wisdom, you might be radiance, you may be purpose, focus, compassion, moxie, hearth, appreciation, creativity, courage. So many different ways of being. And I'm sure you can see that we can take any different combination of these being words and we could create one hell of a set of an Avengers of the content strategy world just by bringing our being together in this space. So I want to go back to this again. When we're doing these things, which are the things that we aligned to the things that we do when our imposter syndrome is showing up, we find that our being can also be a particular way. So we've shared the positive, if you will, being words with you, but we can also be avoidant, nervous, resigned, the victim at effect of everybody else, defensive, very much led by our feelings. We can be living an existence that is a being of anticipation or unwilling, or just being closed and stuck. And I'm sure if you looked at the Avengers or superheroes, they are very rarely these things. They might show up occasionally because there's a piece of their own humanity coming into this. But often what we really see when someone steps into being a superhero is actually them being really intentional about their being. And I'm going to talk now about what it means to be intentional about your being and how to be intentional about your being. I'm going to talk of this in 3 stages. The first stage is for you to actually understand what your being is when you're stepping into your own superhero suit as a content strategist. And I'm going to give you 2 tools that you can think of for this. Now, the first tool is a framework that I actually use in my coaching practice. I trained with Accomplishment Coaching. I'm still part of their affiliate network and I help to train other coaches on their programs as well. And within that organisation, we have a tool known as the Essence Conversation, and it helps to find out and access who we are when we show up in the world as our most brilliant, authentic version of ourselves, free from the fears, the feelings and the self-defence that we might bring when we're in our imposter syndrome being. We call this our essence. My essence name is that I am zeal, I am leader, I'm integrity, I'm connection, and I am mirth. Now, if you want, I can actually take you through this exercise. You can book a free coaching session with me at tracyplayle.com and we can actually discover what your essence is and uncover your essence name. So please do take advantage of that. If you don't want to have a conversation with me direct about that and do the exercise with me, which is totally fine, I'm not attached to that at all, then the VIA Institute of Character has a free tool that you can use online to uncover what they call your character strengths. It's a little bit different from like a skills or competencies type survey. And so when I did this tool, I found that my character strengths were perspective, creativity, leadership, curiosity, and zest. Interestingly, not that different from my essence name or from the being words that I described before about myself as a content strategist. So you can visit viacharacter.org and you can go and take their study as a way of finding out what some of your superhero characteristics actually are. So once you know what your superhero being is, you then want to take the action to actually step into it. And I think of this a little bit like Clark Kent walking into the telephone booth and getting into his Superman suit. That's what we're doing here. So the steps that you're going to want to take to be able to step into your being is firstly to notice how it is for you when you're actually intentional about your being. How do you feel? How do you show up? How do other people respond around you when you're really coming from your essence, your being, or your character strengths? Then become aware of the signs when you've stepped outside of it. So for me, a big one is I notice that I start to get busy. I start to resent people. My well-being might start to suffer. I start to get irritated. I start to feel stressed or anxious. And I start to get body sensations attached to these feelings that are coming up. So I then have an access point through my body and through my thoughts and my feelings to know that I am no longer in my superhero being. And then lastly, create a list for yourself of 5 or 10 things that you can reliably do to help you step back into your being. So mine include things like watching funny dog videos on the internet, or taking my dog for a walk, or playing with her for a little while. They might be things like actually just sitting with my essence name for a moment and just reminding myself and re-presencing myself to that. It includes things like well-being practices like yoga or meditation. There are a number of different things, and they're going to be different for everyone. So write a list of 5 to 10 things that you know you can do to help you step back into your superhero being, so that when you notice you're stepping out of it, you've got a tool to be able to get back into it. And then the third part of this is to stay in your being. To make sure that you stay in your being and you notice that you're in it for as long as you possibly can. And some of this is going to be about really presencing ourselves to what's important to us and silencing the voices that might come from outside of us that want to work in partnership with our imposter gremlins. So when we have experiences that feel like they're not going so well, we might want to ask ourselves the question, what am I making this experience mean about me? Because normally the thing that makes it mean something about us is actually our imposter gremlin, not the experience that we're having. Remember that piece, that we get to be responsible for how we are being about things, not necessarily the things that are happening to us. So when we're in those situations where things seem to be wanting to take us out of those being, just re-presence ourselves to the facts of what are going on in that situation. What are the facts outside of the interpretations that our imposter gremlin is making of this situation? And then lastly, really consider what you're actually committed to and how you're committed to being about the thing that you're experiencing or the thing that you're working on at that moment in time. How do I want to be about this? How do I notice that I am being? And how would I like to be about it instead? And choose from that place. I want to end with a few suggestions for superpowers, I'm calling these, that I think we as content strategists can really work on bringing into our own being in the world. Now, you're going to have being words that are really just who you are, but I also think that there's a place for us to be able to work on this. And some of this is a little bit like developing or growing new muscles for us, especially when the most powerful, well-established muscle within us is our imposter gremlin. What we actually want to do is build up these new muscles, these new superpowers within us. And I'm going to close this session just by talking about 3 of those things. I see some real superpowers for us as content strategists coming from detachment, coming from play, and coming from courage. We'll talk about each of these in turn. Detachment then. I'm talking about detachment within a commitment. I'm not talking about detachment as being not caring. It's a very different thing to be detached within a commitment. The commitment is the higher level thing that we see we're working to. Our purpose, our values, our goals, the things that are really, really important to who we are and the work that we do. But often within that we can get into this muddled mess, particularly when the imposter voice is strong, where we get very attached to things having to go a particular way because we make that mean something about us. So what I'm encouraging you to do here is to really strengthen your muscle of detachment. Being detached from being right about things. One of the conversations that I see us as content strategists having a lot, that we often get attached to being right about it. So 2 examples for you. One is how our views and opinions on FAQ pages, right? We often get a sense of the rightness of our own opinion on that, and then we just gather the evidence that supports our own attachment to being right about our opinion on that. And the other thing that we sometimes get really attached to having to be right about is the definition of what a content strategist is, or a content designer, or whatever that might be. There's a lot of conversation going on about that at the moment. When we detach, we're able to open up space for courage and play to come in as well. So the next superpower then for us to work on developing is courage. And I want to remind you that courage is not about being free of fear, free of worry, free of anxiety. Courage is actually about the ability to be with the fear and to continue to still work towards the commitment. When we bring courage into our being, we're able to ask the difficult questions, have the messy conversations, create new things, invent, come up with our own ideas, develop our own frameworks, start to own content strategy as a profession that we can individually and uniquely own for ourselves, rather than being a profession or an industry that follows a blueprint of how everyone else has done it before. So really work on courage and recognise that courage is not the absence of fear, but courage is being with the fear, but staying, working towards your commitment. And the last place is play. Play with how you fulfill on the commitment. When detachment and courage are present, you open the door for play to be able to come into the space. And when we bring play into the space, we also invite and pave the way for creativity. We get the opportunity to try things in a really new way, a really exciting and different way, and also in a way that can just feel so freeing from the voices that might tell us this is how it should be done, there is a right way to do things, and if you're not knowing how to do them in the right way, that you're an imposter. So detachment, play, and courage actually really open the space up for us to kick the imposter syndrome out and allow our superhero to come in. And finally, I just want to close off by normalising the imposter a little bit more. For many, many years, I really hated this part of myself that was this imposter gremlin, this voice inside me that told me I wasn't good enough, or I didn't belong, or I was a fraud. I hated on it. I made it wrong. And in fact, that was actually part of the behaviours reinforcing themselves, that I was wrong about my career or about what I knew, that I didn't belong. But then I was also wrong to be experiencing imposter syndrome. It held me quite tightly and beautifully stuck in a continuous loop of self-beat up, of which there wasn't really any way to step off of that loop. The only way to step off of it was to really presence myself to my superhero being. So what I'm inviting you to do is to give you another access place to step outside of your imposter syndrome, is not to suppress it or hate it or try and be done with it, just in the same way that I assert that courage isn't about getting rid of fear, but instead fall in love with your imposter gremlin. Give it a cuddle. Because the fact that your imposter gremlin that we spoke about earlier actually really loves the unknown and is completely addicted to the unknown because it can fill that space with those stories that it makes up about you. Being in the unknown can actually also be one of our greatest strengths as a content strategist. The ability to actually be in and be with the unknown is such an incredible superpower. And when we presence ourselves to ourselves as being a superhero instead of the imposter, what we actually get to do with the unknown is incredible. We get to bring play, courage, and detachment into that space. And from that space, we get to choose the story that we fill the unknown with. And so we may as well make that story our own superhero story. Thank you.